Great. So as I said, I'll be sharing this lecture and also sharing the live workshop that Kylie's going to be doing when she joins us up onto the YouTube channel later today. The things that I wanted to sort of cover in this lecture, and it's necessarily quite quick because of the ambitions of this particular section, was some sort of theories and frameworks that are useful for game design practices. I think it's important to note that there's no one right way of designing games. Ideas come from many places, and the process of evolution and creative development vary. But these three models or approaches that we're going to sort of talk about today are quite commonly known in industry. So you can feel quite comfortable talking about them as sort of like design approaches to game making. So the first framing I wanted to talk about was this notion of game feel, which comes from an author called Steve Swink. Steve Swink is an independent game designer and developer. And one of the things that he emphasizes is this sort of notion of game feel, which is the aesthetic sensation we experience when we play games. So game feel is unique to different types of non-interactive experiences in that it emphasizes a sort of tactility and sensation of movement and agency within a game. So as defined here, game feel can be seen as the real-time control of virtual objects in a simulated space with interactions emphasized by polish. So the polish here is super important. And one of the things that you'll be grappling with now is the challenge of bringing together all the component parts of your game. So the visuals, the code within the framing of Unity to build something that's playable. But there's a difference between a playable game and a polished game. And that's part of the reason this class really sort of emphasizes the need for scope and scoping down to a much smaller frame or concept, because the smaller the idea, the more opportunity you have for polishing the experience, and therefore the more sophisticated your game feel is for your future player. So this particular framing identifies building blocks, so this notion of real-time control, polish, and simulated space. So simulated space sort of extends our senses. It helps us feel part of the game world, so we stop thinking of ourselves as being separate or outside the experience you're playing. Polish has a real sort of like tacit feel. I'm talking about the sort of fast-paced action of a fighting game, or the sort of smooth physics movement of a journey. You know, we can describe different types of feels that different types of game offer us. And so the control aspect of that is super important. So if there are delays to your control schemes in your games, your player may well feel frustrated and fall out of this sort of feeling of immersion and engagement with her game experience. So Swink talks about challenge, which is a sort of like a core aspect of game design. So many of you are looking at different types of challenges with your concept, but the challenge that a game has offers a player a sort of different sensations of control. For example, I think that we've spoken in previous classes very briefly about this sort of like concept of flow. So flow is the sort of sweet spot between the challenge of an experience and a player's developing skill. So if a game is too hard for me, I'm going to feel anxious and confused, and may not get to the sort of pleasure of that particular experience. Alternately, if a game is like really sort of simple and straightforward, maybe I'll get bored too easily. So whilst in the context of this class, it's hard to tune a game to think about different sort of like difficulty settings, I think that the basic feedback one should start to get through the sort of playtesting that you're going to be doing quite soon is how legible is the game, how easy it is for your player to engage with. How does she succeed through the gameplay experience? So challenge is built by constraints and goals. Your game expresses the goals that you have through developing it and frames those constraints for your players. So game space, as we know, needs to be readable. We need to be able to see what the constraints and goals of a particular experience are. Game feel is interesting because it sort of extends our senses. It goes beyond our vision and our hearing. It's a sort of, as I say, a sort of proprioceptive sense. So proprioception is our sense of positioning in space. And in games, we often lose focus on any particular sort of sensory modality and feel invited to act and to have agency and control of the experience as we move forward. And I find this particular model and frame an interesting way of thinking about the feedback loop that happens between games and players. So on the right-hand side of the screen, we have a sort of diagrammatic representation of the player. So you can see the brain and the hand of the player on the left, the controller, the response, and the metaphor, and this extends into the actual game world itself. So think about this feedback loop. How does that work? How does that create a pleasurable experience instead of challenge to your player? What is her intent? And how is that communicated through this system? Now, I'm aware that many of you are building and constructing the different elements of your game. I'm sure that you'll be testing it yourself within your teams. And if you're not yet set into a schedule of sharing builds, I'd encourage you to make sure that as many people in a particular team as possible have the opportunity to pull your Unity file to be able to sort of engage in what's been built so far, to be able to play test and get involved with the technicalities of working. So if you haven't got a build of your game on your own computer at home, I'll encourage you to make sure that you do so moving forward. One of the things I think you'll find happens is that you'll have regular formal builds of your game, and that's something that might happen multiple times a week. If in your team and in your context, you have a fixed release of your game once a week, then all team members should be pulling that release in order to sort of play test and to see how the game is responding to these types of criteria. So as you can see listed here, thinking about input, response, context, polish, metaphor, and rules are a helpful way of measuring the feel of your game for your future player. When we make games, we're making games out of our own interest, but we're making games for a future player. So starting to think about what her experience is as soon as you can, and starting to sort of play test your actual build is an important part of iteration. And taking things which are sort of concepts and things that you feel might work in a game, and being able to get feedback from your player about whether your assumptions are actually the case. So there's some general principles around this particular sort of framing, and you'll hear feedback from our guests at Critique that talk about feel. But thinking about providing predictable results. So when a player acts in your game, they need to get a response that they expect. That response needs to be quick, it needs to be instantaneous. We've all spent way too long of our lives dealing with the sort of spinning beach ball of doom, as my daughter calls it, waiting for computers to catch up with us. Feedback in your game as to something that's happening is really central to your player feeling in control of the experience and to get a sense of her progress. So thinking about sort of frames of building game mechanics that are easy but deep. So something that's sort of a mechanic that's easy to engage, but allows for multiple sort of like repetition and then that through that repetition, it enables the player to achieve mastery through a particular mechanic. So yeah, so although the response to an input is predictable, there's enough subtlety and expressiveness in your controls to keep it feeling fresh and interesting. And excuse me, excuse me again. Yeah. Let's move on. So the sensation of a control that you offer your player needs to be pleasing. Again, I go back to the example I gave earlier in this lecture of Journey. The physics in Journey is pleasurable in and of itself. And it took a really long time for that team to develop and tune and tweak, so much so that that notion of movement through that game company games reoccurs and repeats. So it's a sort of signature aesthetic of that particular game designer and game developer. And that's something that is separate from the game itself. The game should feel good to play, regardless of the rules and the environment, the art, and so forth. Now I want to move on to a slightly different frame, in that thinking about balancing difficulty. So often there's a distinction, I think, between an experience that's hard to play because people haven't thought about the UI or the user experience. There's nothing worse than playing a game where the developers haven't had an opportunity to finish it, and parts of the interface don't respond as quickly as they should. A bad interface design shouldn't be a reason for a lack of success on the point of view of your future player. So the Miyazaki criteria, which I think is really interesting in the context of a hard game like Dark Souls, is that, and I'll just read these out super quickly. So players need to be able to learn from the mistakes and to have an opportunity to develop skill through repetition. If they fail, it must be clear and understandable as to why they've done so. Each problem needs to have multiple solutions, and the game's controls, as I mentioned before, can never be a factor from which the difficulty of the game is derived. So Miyazaki suggests that as long as an obstacle passes these criteria, that he's happy he has achieved the maximum level of difficulty while retaining the necessary element of fairness. So give your player an opportunity to succeed, and don't let your design decisions or your UI decisions or your control scheme decisions get in the way of her success. And the final model that I wanted to sort of run over super quickly this morning is the 3 C's. The 3 C's actually come from a game designer called Mark Cerny and were presented at GDC many years ago, and is a way of thinking about game design. It's also the control scheme that folk like Ubisoft use in their design discussions. They spend a lot of time talking about framing their experiences through this particular set of criteria. So let me move on. So character is not purely relevant to player characters or non-player characters. Characters can also refer to the environment and the design of your space. But thinking through games that do have a sort of CG character in them, it's really important to think about form following function. There's a great article about the use of silhouettes in Team Fortress or Left 4 Dead or something, which talks about in very sort of fast-paced play, often the player has difficulty reading the scene quickly enough to understand what she must do. And so thinking about designing characters to fit particular silhouettes helps them express how they play, and also helps you understand how you can work together in sort of co-op games, for example. So form needs to follow function. A character's action and personality should determine their appearance. And I think that we can think of sort of famous player characters that have particular personality traits that create a memorable play experience for us within sort of third person contexts. So those of you who have done animation and illustration before will be relatively comfortable with the notion of using sort of shapes to communicate different types of values to your audience. This is something that's really relevant in game design context as well. And again, I would argue applies to the development of 3D objects as well as 3D characters. So there's some great text. This is I can't see the top of my screen, but this is a book on game design practices that looks at breaking down player movement distances. So for those of you who are building characters, it's worth thinking about how your character moves across space in your game. So like, how tall is your character? What's the sort of sense of scale and scope in your environment? So this just gives you a set of guidelines to work to as you move towards animating the objects within your game world. And thinking about the pace and speed of different types of movement actions you have as you start to build up your sort of animation libraries, I think is that you may be able to sort of reuse certain movement actions in different contexts. And certainly this list of actions is, I would say, ambitious for the amount of time that you have, but try not to get stuck on one particular part of asset production. Try and think about the production pipeline as moving from design to build to rig to animation to integration. So there's a well-established development pipeline for game objects and game characters. And I think one of the things that's tough as you're scheduling is apportioning sufficient amount of time to allow for you to animate fully. So yeah, so I haven't recently looked at your sort of like itch dev blogs, but I'd be really interested in seeing animated design and sort of sketches of objects and characters within your world, within sort of like ongoing updates. Hi, I'm seeing some faces, that's great. So player characters and NPCs are really useful tools to reflect in-game status. So thinking about how you as game artists and game designers use the whole of your game environment to signal back to your player as to what's currently happening. So whether it be an idle loop if nothing's happening, or whether it be the use of lighting to breadcrumb particular directions, I think that environmental design really signals to your player what she should do and how she should move forward. So that's a sort of like very quick run through different types of approaches to character. The second C in the 3 Cs is camera. Now, many of you in your design presentations expressed or were clear about the cameras you were deciding to use, but just to sort of reiterate and reinforce how important that is. So as we know, if you use first person, the assumption is that the player is the character. And if you use a third person cameras, there's a sort of a zoom out where the player is controlling the key character in the game. And I think that these different styles of address create different types of experience. So using static cameras, are they scrollable? Are you first person, third person? Do you want the player to be able to control the camera? If you do, then that's a sort of a part of the development schedule that you have, and you need to make sure that you have enough time and you spend enough care thinking about the player controls so that she can shift through the view of your game environment in a way that gives her the widest possible sort of visibility of what she's meant to do as you move forward. So treat your camera like it's a spotter. So you should be able to see, the player should be able to see what she needs to do next, and be really careful with how you give your player control versus when you take it away. So, so signal that mode shift so your player knows what to expect and doesn't get sort of jarred out of camera control to a lack of control. And I think that one of the things that's helpful with, certainly with sort of like fixed cameras, is to think about how you use film techniques to sort of like heighten the dramatic context within your game. Maybe you want to use a high camera at the beginning of a scene in order to give your player a view of your environment so that she understands where she's meant to move. And as you move forward in the game, you then bring a camera into sort of more direct action. Anyway, never let the character out of the camera sight. And I don't think many of you are taking on sort of multiple players, but thinking about ways of accommodating more than one player is important as well. So the third part of the 3 C's is control. So humans are playing your games. So thinking about taking advantage of prior control schemes helps take advantage of previous gamer literacy. Don't reinvent your control scheme unless you have to, because I think that you want your player to immerse herself in your game as quickly as possible. So there are some things that it's worth reinventing and doing differently, and there's other things which are not. So one of the things about the sort of standard controllers in Unity is certainly the movement controllers often feel quite skatey. So you'll notice when you start moving player characters around within your scene that often there's a particular sort of like floatiness to the controls. And that's something that you may want to tune or tweak to have a feeling of a weight or significance of your sort of player character. But when you're playing the builds, as you develop and evolve them, you should be asking yourself questions about, you know, how does the camera feel? How do the controls feel? How does the game itself feel? So most of these particular points are relatively self-evident. And I just wanted to sort of reiterate the point that your controls should be as responsive as they can be. When you act, there should be a response. And think quite hard about how your control schemes fits within your wider design frame. Yeah, so these, the 3 C's are what you'll find probably with the Ubisoft feedback later in the course is that there'll be a lot of feedback relevant to the 3 C's. And I wanted to introduce that concept to everybody here, so that there's an ability to sort of pay attention to these particular sort of frames as you sort of move forward with your builds. I'm not going to talk about beat charts. And I'm going to run really quickly through this. I don't know how many of you have had chance to review Bryn Davis's lecture. He did a lecture earlier, like 2 weeks ago, I think, on level design. And I'd encourage you to go back and look at that, that lecture, because I think obviously as somebody who has a sort of current design practice, it will be a lot more applied than the frame here. And I'm hoping you're all at the stage of file construction where you're starting to sort of implement and grey box different elements of your levels and start thinking about things like layout. So these are different types of approaches. I mean, one of the things that, so most of this class, as you know, is framed through group work. There are 2 or 3 pieces of work which are largely around your own documentation that I'm asking everybody to submit individually. And thinking about sort of like sketches of levels is an example of something I would imagine to be part of your documentation processes and part of what you may submit as part of that as you move forward. So just to say that when you think about an environment, to think about sort of landmarks to orient your player so she understands where the game is taking it to, so that she understands the path she can take, and so she can explore the edges or the boundaries of the environment that she's building. Often when we play new games, the first thing we do is find the edge of the space so that we figure out how to succeed in moving forward. So blocking out particular environments, thinking about player visibility and boundaries is a really important part of setting the space or the environment that your game takes place within. And I think that one of the things hopefully that's been emphasized through the range of different sessions that you've had is thinking about repetitive use of assets. Emma from Pitiful Planet did a great lecture about 5 years ago about the importance of stones, but thinking about your level as a playground where you can sort of reuse objects and think about the scope of your environment and where you can fix those settings, I think helps your level become more legible to your future player. Overhead maps is a really useful design tool. For those of you who've come to sort of the design document presentations, I always really appreciate the time taken in hand making or hand sketching particular levels or puzzles or dynamics or interactions, because I think that that helps you think through some of the implications of what you're building rather than sort of rushing into sort of asset creation straight away. So as I've just mentioned, there are many techniques around breadcrumbing. Breadcrumbing is a sort of a term for giving signals to your player so she can sort of understand where to move. In the old days, that could be as simple as a cursor turning to a hand to indicate something is being grabbable. In sort of contemporary 3D times, that's much more often achieved through use of lighting. So again, I'm aware many of you are in the midst of thinking about your asset development. But if you haven't got somebody on your team who is tasked with thinking about lighting, thinking about signaling the player, then I'd encourage you to set that role in place. And as I've mentioned in class before, in Pitfall Planet, Adam did the lighting. So the lighting doesn't need to be a task for an art team. It can be an activity that's taken up by another team member. And it's certainly really important to spend time and care on things like lighting your environment to end up doing justice to your concept as you move forward. What UI have you got? Are you using maps? How are you using your UI? Who's designing that? And have you got a prototype or a version of your UI working within the build that you're centering around developing now? Some really interesting things around sort of proportionality of what you place where in a screen. I think that screens, or certainly when we're playing games, our attention is drawn to particular parts of the screen. So thinking about how you frame action within 50% of the screen center, for example, is a good guideline for placement of critical elements. So what are the sort of the values, the descriptors, the emotion that you want to set up with your level? You should be able to describe as the sensation you want your player to experience as she engages in your environment. So thinking about that does affect or should affect the level, your level placement and your environment design. Think about the feeling or the value that you wish to express through your art, through your gameplay, and through your development process. Okay. So I'm going to